Hi, everybody. I'm Poiesz. I'm the product manager for the Android framework. I wanted just to thank everybody for sticking through on a Friday on permissions. So we're going to talk about some of the best practices, some of the new stuff that's an end that was talked about in the keynote, and getting some into the specifics, into the nitty-gritty. But first, let's kind of start with where we are and kind of where we're going to. And so today, we kind of have a situation where users have awareness of what permissions are, but they don't have the level of control that we want them to have. We also have an issue for developers that are updating their applications, are making really tough decisions about, do I add this permission? Do I want to get a hit on my update rate? And so we're looking to solve that as well. And the last one is this install friction that we get as well. When you're clicking the install button, it doesn't actually install, right? You get a prompt saying, hey, here's a bunch of information that you probably don't want to read right now, but we're going to show it to you, and you're going to hit this accept button, and then we'll download it and install it for you. And so the question that we kind of asked ourselves a lot over the last years and months I've been looking at this problem is, how do we make it better? And so here's what we've come up with. And so the idea is we want to make this much simpler for users to understand. And the idea being, if it's simpler and it's focused on the things that users care about, then they're more empowered and in more control. The other part is we want to put in the control on the developers is that you can request these permissions at runtime at the point in time it makes sense for you to provide context to the user about why you want it. And the last one is to also improve some information to the user about auditing. And the idea for auditing, and we'll talk about it a little bit, is that if you have an understanding of what applications do what's normal, what's different, users can also make informed decisions about odd behaviors. And so here's the list of permissions in their entirety. The keynote didn't have the full set, by the way. So we start off with location and camera, which are fairly straightforward. The next is microphone. And so microphone is separate from camera. So camera controls photos and video. So if you're doing video with audio recording, you'll want to request both. Phone includes phone state and dialing. So this is if your application is performing functionality that makes calls often or is trying to manage calling, you'll want to request this. These are groups, by the way, just as a moment, forgot to mention. There's still the individual permissions that you request. These are just the high-level groups, and we'll talk about a little distinction a little bit later. For SMS as well is for controlling and reading SMS on your application. And then the next two are pretty straightforward, contacts and calendar, each being separate for read and write access to your contacts and calendar respectively. And the last one is about sensors. And sensors is a tricky one. Users don't really understand this one quite yet really well. It's around heart rate monitors, body information, and body sensors. And this is a new space that's evolving pretty quickly, and we wanted to make sure it was accounted for in the new permissions model. So what this gives us then is now we're asking at runtime, we don't need to have a prompt when you're clicking the install button. Installing now does the thing that it says it does. It installs. This also means updates can now happen automatically. And so when you're getting your applications pushed, they include new permissions. Those permissions aren't granted on install anymore. They're granted at runtime. So those APK binaries can all get pushed right away. And so what happens at runtime then? When do you ask? How do you ask? And so this is where you're able to ask the user, at a point in time that makes sense in your application, what you want to have access to. In this case here, we have Hangouts asking for the ability to manage phone calls. These are unique for each user, so no longer is this applied across all users on your device. It's individual to each Android user. And there's a special note here, and we'll talk about this in the best practices a little bit later, is about don't ask again. On the first request, the users are not going to see this checkbox. So you'll just have the question and allow deny. Allow deny in this world is a long time. It's not a one-time response. It's a forever answer. But developers are able to ask again in the case of saying no. And the trick is, on the second request and subsequent requests after the user said no, they have a shush kind of button where they can say, don't ask me again. And this is a clear indicator to us at the OS level that the user and the developer aren't really on the same page about what's being asked of them. And what will happen is feature requests by the developer go straight to the no answer. We don't prompt UI. We won't bother the user with it because they've indicated this flag. And so the idea is the first request, there's no penalty. So feel free to use it. On the subsequent requests, make sure you and the user are on the same page about what you're talking about. And we'll cover this again in the best practices because it's a big point that we want to make great about the experience. The other part is in system settings. And so in system settings now, not only can users, like today, see all the permissions, but they see the new groups. And they have nice little toggle switches next to these groups. And so every application on your device, users are now going to be able to toggle these switches. This means that they're able to look at something. They can turn things on that are off, turn things off that are on. There's no penalty with them turning stuff off. So if a user says no to something, you have the ability to ask again. they'll then have that prompt, as I mentioned before, to say don't ask again if it's been too often. And the idea is this is always available anytime, all applications. And that's a big distinction and really empowering users to use these controls. We also have a vertical view. And so in the vertical view, I can look at camera. And this is that auditing I was mentioning before. And then the user can look at every application who's using camera. And I can say, oh, these ones make sense. I use these. Oh, these ones that don't make so much sense to me. Let me turn those off. And if the application then is running, and they can say, hey, you turned off camera for me, but I do really cool things with the camera. You should turn this back on. And they're like, oh, you do cool things with the camera. I'll turn you back on. And so that's like what will lead into, what do you do? We have this world, and so what are the best practices for the developer? And the trick is, for many folks, you kind of feel a little nervous, I guess, as a developer. And you start feeling like, what's the user going to do? What's going to happen? I'm not really sure. And so these best practices we're going to talk about are so that you don't have it's not guesswork. This should really be predictable. Users should understand why you're asking. And when users understand what your value proposition is, and you're explaining yourself clearly, they're going to say yes most of the time. And so that's kind of the idea. And so let's talk about some of those practices. One is having a warm welcome. And all these practices, by the way, you don't have to do them all. This is just kind of covering a variety of things that make sense depending on situations and how you structure your application. And so the idea here is on a warm welcome is you're kind of pitching the user on what it is your application does. You'll see this in Google Now as an example. It's an application that asks for a lot of permissions. It's very integrated into your experience. And so they're making very clear in the Google Now application what their value proposition is to the user. And when that's made, it makes sense when you ask for things up front. And so in a case here, we have Hangouts asking for SMS, and it also will ask for other permissions as well. But the idea is when you're asking it up front, and it makes sense, where your application, Hangouts case, manages and sends SMS and messaging in general, there's no real dissonance between the application, what its use case is, what the user expectation is for this application, and what it's asking for. If it was coming up and asking for calendar out of the blue, I'd probably be scratching my head and wondering what's going on. And this is where we don't need to provide that education for these initial requests where it makes sense based upon your functionality of your application. For things where it's a bit more edgy, or maybe you don't need to ask for it up front, and it's a particular feature, and here we're looking at keep again, or keep the first time. And you have an option here for recording, where I can record a voice note, and it'll transcribe the voice note. And this is a great case where now it makes sense for me, the user in this case, clicking the record button, and keep asking me if I can record audio. And I'm like, of course you can. And this is the structure that we want to have, where you and the user are on the same page. This also avoids cases of double prompting, which we've seen in other platforms where we have similar kind of runtime models. And we really want to avoid a double prompt. And so the idea is if you're asking the first time, and there's no penalty on the first request, go ahead and ask. If they say no, be cool about it. And then figure out what's the best way to ask again at some future point in time. Maybe you wait until the next time I hit the record button and say, hey, you're hitting the record button. You want to record a voice note? I'm like, I do. And so that's kind of the idea for it. Also, you don't always need permissions. And so it's on the highlight that we have a variety of system intents in the platform. So these are for camera, for making phone calls, for getting contacts. These don't require permissions. The reason they don't require permissions is because the user is the one pressing the button, selecting the contact, taking the photo. And so your application is freely able to invoke these. So when this is an option, highly preferable to use these approaches because it doesn't require any upfront ask. And it lets the user know, like, the developer is caring about my ability to set actions. The next one is, what if your application needs a variety of things to do its job? And as an example here, using Hangouts, Hangouts is a messaging client. So it would need things like contacts, phone permission, and SMS. And so we have an option for allowing a developer to request multiple permissions in one go. Now we do, as you're seeing in the animation here, present them one at a time to the user. So the idea is you want to be balanced in how you're presenting these multiple requests. If they make sense and they're relatively narrow, you'll get a quick user understanding and a quick response. If you try to blast everything up front, you'll probably get some no's in there. And so the idea is to do the things that make sense for the user. The next one is give a response immediately. If you ask for something, think of it as an exchange. I'm going to give you some of my data. What are you going to do for me? And so in the case of Earth, it's a really obvious one. Zoom in to where you currently are. But there's lots of other ones that are particular to your application. But always think about what's my ROI when the user's thinking about it. What am I going to give them back? In cases where you ask for something and it's not immediately understandable to the user as to why you asked, they're going to wonder why they turned it on. And they might go turn it off. The next thing is to look at the material design documents that we have online and the guidelines that are online. Empty state is a really useful one to take a look at and think about how, if you have a function, maybe you have a search view and your search view depends on certain permissions to populate its data, how do you present an empty state? Or how do you present the suggestion of, this is better if you had this? And so those kind of structures enable users to understand your value proposition better and get them to say yes to these different, the different permissions that you're looking to have. And so let's get into the little bit more the nitty-gritty that I mentioned before. And this is that on an M, we're not requiring all applications to support runtime permissions. However, if you're on an M device and you're compiling against the M SDK with the target of API 23, you're going to be in the permissions model. And so what this is going to mean is you need to write some really complex code. I know it's pretty rough. But what we have here are just kind of highlighting the two main APIs that you're going to be wanting to look at. One is check self permissions, and the other one is request permissions. And so the idea is you'll check, hey, what permissions do I have available to me right now? If you're missing anything that you need, you can request those permissions and then continue on with your functionality, assuming it's gone well. That's kind of the structure of it. You don't have to worry about callbacks at runtime, where you are wondering, like, what if I'm in the middle of an operation and the user turns off a permission for me in settings? Not to worry, we kill your process. So the good part about that, though, as opposed to being killed, is it's the same method as if you're in low memory. So there's not a special mode or handling to do here. It's treated the same as a low memory condition. But what happens is then is when you're booting up in your application sequence, just check your permissions values. If you always do that as on your startup, you check your results and cache them, you'll be fine. They won't change on you. They'll only change when you ask, and they'll go in the positive sense. They'll never go away on you. When they go away, you'll get killed and brought back up. So you don't have to worry about runtime handling. The last one is you might be kind of furiously thinking, where do I use permissions? What are my APIs that are using permissions? How am I going to check them? And so this is what we've added in Android Studio. And if you were in that talk, they made mention of it. So I'll cross-reference their mentioning of my stuff and with their stuff, is they added annotations. And what annotations does is it introduces new lint warnings and errors so that when you're using Studio and you add a function that needs a permission, in the case here I'm using the location manager to get the location of the user, I'll get a warning saying, hey, your APK doesn't actually declare the necessary permission to use this function. Also, we'll notice is if you don't have a check around, you're not guarding this particular call. And we give you a templatized version where we can populate in a little boilerplate piece of code to help you do a request. And so that way everything is about our M apps on the M SDK. And so you may be wondering, what about all these L apps and pre-M applications that are all out there? How are they going to behave in this model? Because if you noticed before, I said a lot of alls and every about these different controls. And so one thing that's going to be different is at install time, you're still going to see the current dialog. So because applications that are pre-M don't understand what it means to have the permissions taken away or what it means to start up with nothing, we're going to treat them a little bit differently. So we're still going to prompt to the user. There'll be a call out that this application is a legacy app in play. And on install, you'll be granted your permissions. Pretty much the same as today. Also, updates will now be blocking as they are today instead of the smooth ones that I spoke about before. The next thing, though, is in the settings panel. Users will still be able to turn off settings on your applications. Now, this isn't going to cause security exceptions for you. That would happen in the new model if your app is on the M SDK. But in this case, what we do is we identify that this application is compiled on an older SDK, and we begin feeding it empty state data. And so if we were to ask for, what's the location? We'd say, the location's not available. It's a valid error state. If you'd say, are there any contacts? No, there aren't any contacts. When you want to save a contact, we're like, OK, yeah, we saved it. No, we didn't save it. And so when you check it, you would find that it'd be empty. So this can make some wonky behaviors in applications. Users will get a warning. So when they're turning something off, we just don't want to let the user flip it off and assume it's going to be OK, or if the app starts behaving strangely. So we do have this warning to make sure users are aware. This is a control that they have, but also they may need to come back and turn it back on, or maybe they have to get rid of the application if they end up in an odd behavior. An example might be as I do Hangouts and I see it's using camera, and it's not maybe not apparently obvious to me that it needs camera. I turn it off. A few weeks later, I have a Hangout call, and the video's not working. And I go like, why? And I might not go, oh, because I turned off the camera. I have to go back and flip it on. Hopefully, Hangouts won't have that problem because they'll be a modern application, but just for the example. The last one is when things are turned off in a pre-M app, because it's not on the M SDK, it can't request permissions. And this is where we're really looking for app developers to adopt the model as quickly as you can. This really only makes good sense for users when we only have one model where everything is runtime, as opposed to the hybrid that we're going to have in the beginning. Like I've used the metaphor that this is switching from the left side of the road to the right side of the road. It's going to be a little messy in the beginning. And so we really want to make sure that applications are moving over. We've tried to give a lot of incentives for developers to move over, especially around being able to ask multiple times, around being able to ask in bulk, and making updates more seamless when you're adding new permissions. And so with that, I'm ending early. So if you're planning to head home, you'll be able to go home early. But if not, lots of Q&A. I'm assuming there's lots of questions here, so I'll stay here for the next, I think we have 24 minutes. And if you guys have questions, feel free to go to the mic up ahead and try this out. Also, there's a full code example on the website. We have code snippets of all this stuff. There's a big write-up about permissions, about the best practices, about the behaviors. There'll be more coming out on best practices and behaviors and UI guidelines. So please check developer.com, developer.android.com for new updates. And with that, thank you. Go for it.
Hi, it's cool to have granular permissions finally. Reminds me of iOS sometimes. Speaking of which, is there a way to supply an explanation of why we're asking for the permission?
Not right now. We are looking at the options of like a note from the developer in the dialog that I was showing. There's a little bit of trickiness of when the OS is kind of stating a piece of information on behalf of an application developer. Like, is that a false premise? Is it legitimate? And so we're trying to deal with what's the right way to present a balance. Like, this is a statement from the developer while it's in system UI. If you do feel like you need to explain to the user why you want something, I highly recommend like the approach that we mentioned before. Ask first. There's no penalty if the user says no. If they say no, present rationalization, present your value proposition to them. If they still say no, let it be. But the idea is the first request, users that understand your value prop, they get one dialogue. That's great. Users that don't, they'll get a no. They'll see your value proposition. If they still say no, let it be.
Thanks.
Yep.
What happened to the rest of the permissions? Like if I've got an app that wants to do Wi-Fi scanning, where'd that one go?
Yeah.
And what do
So there's a lot of refactoring that we've been doing under the hood and soul searching about permissions. One of the things that I didn't mention is there's dangerous permissions and normal permissions. And so normal, everything that's flagged as normal, you don't have to worry about being taken away. Those are still automatically granted. There's no toggle to turn those off. Things like Wi-Fi, we're changing some of the semantics around how they get requested and some of the rules around how you get MAC addresses. So one of the more nuanced items, I'll mention it now so you can find that out later, is if you're trying to find out the MAC address of remote Bluetooth devices when doing Wi-Fi scans. Those will come back null unless you actively hold the location permission, since typically remote MAC addresses for Bluetooth and Wi-Fi tend to be about finding and triangulating your location. So we've done some restructuring and behavioral stuff under the hood. That's actually somewhat documented already, but there'll be more coming out on that. If you look at developer.com, the current highlight on permissions, it actually mentions some of that stuff about Wi-Fi specifically.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
So I may have missed it, but there's no category for internet-style permission, right?
Correct.
So that means by default, all internet-like permission are basically allowed to the app?
Yep.
So that also means like you could have a flashlight application that could just get the internet permission and then send data back to whoever.
Yeah, so a flashlight application could have internet. Then, though, we'll have to ask for all permissions to get data off your device. So the idea is because we're preventing access to the data up front, it may have the internet, but it's not going to have anything that we're concerned about, at least that the user should be concerned about.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So did you consider a model of sandboxing instead of just returning like null information? And what is the possibility of that in the future?
Yeah, sandboxing is something we've been looking at for a few different things, but it's not something we're planning on doing, at least right now. The idea was to try and minimize, like in the sandbox, you mean like to provide like fake data as opposed to just null
fake
set?
data or just only
Yeah.
certain data. Like if they wanted to save a contact, we could let them have access to
Yeah.
that one contact.
Yeah, it's kind of, you create a new kind of issue as like now the application is working and the data set's kind of disjoint and the user really notices weird behaviors where if you're seeing a null set, it becomes much more obvious. So where I go to calendar and my calendar application shows no calendar entries and it's much more obvious as to what's going on. But yeah.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Has there been any thought of granting an equivalent of like the intent handler chooser of a just once? So, grant permission to do the action I'm doing right now, but not blanket permission from now on?
Yeah, so we're looking at a number of different ways that developers can ask for different types of data. We're trying to look at them as like, things that are just once, things that are user chooses, or things that are more blanket independent access. What we're trying to do is balance like user fatigue on seeing too many. So at least right now, we're trying to avoid the just once for these groups of permissions. But for the intent ones that you're mentioning, those are kind of like the way we're structuring just once, is fire the intent, and it's a one-time picker for it. But thanks for the comment. Yeah.
Can you clarify about the don't ask again option? So if a user selects that and say like in the keep app, they hit the record button again, do we get a security exception or?
No, you'll get a fast no from that. So if a user says, don't ask me again, you invoke the API to check, the OS will respond very quickly with a no. You do have the information to know that the user said, don't ask again. And so this can be, like when the user says, don't ask again, you're aware of that, and can be either, there's a few different strategies you can take. Depending on how important the feature is, you might just say, let's just hide the record button. You might just say, oh, no, maybe we should keep the record button. If they press it again, we're back in the game. But generally, you should consider the don't ask again, like almost like the nuclear option. It's what we're using it as a signal of dissonance between the developer and the user.
Okay. And at that point, we would present, if we kept the option on the screen, we would present like a message saying that, hey, you disabled this permission, so we can't do this. If you want, can we link them to the, do we have a direct intent to the settings?
You have an intent to take them to this app page for yourself,
okay.
But not to the permissions page
okay.
specifically. So we did want to make it kind of a big deal when the user says don't ask again. Okay. But you will have recourse. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Hi.
Hi.
I have a question about compatibility. So will I still be able to build a single APK targeting Android M and leverage this new permission model and have it work properly on the older devices that do not support it?
No. Yes. No. So I'm sure anyone would believe me if I said no. So yes. So the structure of it is, since you're still declaring the fine-grained permissions, the individual ones, because those are being mapped into the larger groups that you're seeing, you don't really need to do anything special on older ones. Support.lib has mainly null functioning for the different functions when you're calling check permission grants and request permissions. All those things get nulled out, so you don't have to do anything special in your code to deal with older OSs. You just keep doing what you're doing, declare ones. There is one, it's more of an advanced feature, but you're kind of asking about it, is let's say you have a permission you want to add. You don't have it today. You want to add it only on M devices, because you don't want to take the hit on L devices. And so we have a manifest option that you can define that will allow you to only ask for this new permission and declare it on M devices. This way, your L devices don't get impacted by your requests and requiring users to accept, but you can get the free flow up front. It's a choice. If you want them all, go for it. If you only want it on the new ones, go for that as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, in case of legacy device admin apps, would user will be allowed to disable the permissions?
Yes.
Is there any way to disable that?
Disable being able to turn off the permissions?
Yes.
Not in which sense? By who?
For device admin apps,
For development apps.
where admin wants to control the device.
Oh, I get you. So in the case of device owner and profile owner, which are kind of the Android work features that we have in Android, there is an ability to set policies around the permissions. So if you're doing, as they have mentioned, a KOSU device, it's a corporate-owned single-use device, like a kiosk. You could then say, I want this application running. I want its permissions enforced to these values. And so as your device owner in that scenario, you're able to dictate terms.
Okay.
Device owner is not device admin. It's a different concept. But that's a cases where you want to be able to have that stricter control. But in general, we're pretty sensitive to making sure users have the full power of this.
So legacy device admin won't have those permissions.
Correct. Device admin is, we're kind of transitioning that. It's maybe an aside, but we are transitioning that to a more consumer-oriented feature set, as opposed to a corporate feature set, with device owner and profile owner being the tools that are better scoped and have better longevity than device admin.
Okay, thank you.
Does this code have any kinship to the apps ops feature that was briefly in 4.3?
I blanked out there. What was that?
Does this,
I was waiting for someone to ask. Sorry.
Yeah.
It has, we learned a lot from AppOps. I think a lot of the technical guts of it are how we implemented the fallback behavior for L. but we found by itself, without a more like holistic relook and rethink and restructure of how we do permissions, it didn't make a lot of sense. But it does have some underpinnings from that.
Got it.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I can see cases when it can be really annoying to the user asking permissions at runtime. Is there a plan for still allowing people to ask permissions all at once ahead of time? So
it's something we're looking at, and we're going to be tracking like pretty closely to see what's going on. Myself, I'm very sensitive to that. The reason is if we end up with user fatigue on these, you end up not actually helping people, right? And so there's this balance of making sure that we have enough prompts, but not so many that the users are like, I don't care, just go away. So we're going to be keeping a close eye on that. At the moment, the reason, just to be blunt, that we structured it where we let you request many, but then that we'll present them one at a time, is that we have the API for you to ask for multiple things, and we have then the right at some point to change the UI, right? Where we could say, okay, we do think it's more appropriate to show multiple in one shot as opposed to one-on-one. The reason we didn't was many teams, thankfully, were very honest with us internally about what they planned to do if that existed, and we kind of extrapolated to what we saw around external developers as to what they would do, and we felt most applications would probably just ask for everything up front and then fall back to asking individually, and that's arguably worse than the situation we have today. So that's the main reason we didn't do it, but it is something we're keeping an eye on.
Thanks.
Similar to the previous one, what's happening with applications that listening to intents and start services without any UI, even on app install?
So applications that have no UI whatsoever but need permissions, I don't really understand those, just to be honest. But there are ways to get something. If you don't have an appropriate way to ask for something, say you're a background service and it's hard to present yourself, one is you can invoke an activity directly. You could present a notification as well. And the notification could be hey, turn on this permission. And they click it, and you can invoke these dialogues from the notification. So you do have some recourse. But the idea is even if you're in the background, you need to be able to present your ROI effectively in your use case to the user as to why you want to be given that permission.
Hi.
Yes.
So if a user has denied a permission twice, and they've said, don't ask me again, but it turns out that permission is actually kind of critical for the application to function. You said that we should show some messaging that says this is required to turn on. Will there be an intent provided that we could actually take you straight to the permission settings for your application?
Yes, so you can intent directly to settings to the top level for it. If they've said don't ask again, you can only intent to your application level. If they haven't said don't ask again, so maybe it's the second request and they haven't said that apocalyptic version, you can intent directly to your permissions page. And that's a difference that we make, like to try and balance the user's statement that they don't want to be asked anymore. Okay. So generally, I think it's important to the model is ask first, it's cool, but the second ask, be pretty sure the user's on the same page as you before you ask again. And that's where things like screeners or hey, I do this, is that okay? And they're like, yeah, okay, now prompt. Consider the second prompt to be, be careful about the second prompt because they might check the box.
Okay, so if it's already been denied and they say don't ask again, you cannot go to the permission settings page. But if they haven't,
if they haven't checked don't ask again, then you can intent directly to the permissions page. If they have, you can't.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Hi, are OEM installed apps still subject to the same runtime permission checks?
That's a good question. So yes, they are. We are working on some specific policies to avoid silly situations, like things where calling doesn't work and things like that. But in general, yes, we do want it to be a runtime model, so we do want the people to be asking.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
You mentioned briefly system intents that have implied permissions. My question is specifically around the context. When you have the people picker, it gives you permissions. It seems in practice to only give you permission actually to the full name and the phone number, I believe, not the email address or anything else. Is there any chance you might take a look at that again?
Yes.
Okay.
I will take a look at that again.
Thanks.
What if you've included a library that requires permissions and it's not compiled?
Yes, it's going to call it. You should know what your libraries are asking for and need. Either the library should be doing requests for you or letting you know very clearly what they may be needing. it can create kind of a strained situation for the developer if you're including a library and it needs a permission and it starts exploding because it doesn't understand the new model, but you compiled it on the new SDK, but maybe they're not ready for the new SDK. So something to be aware of. I don't have a good fix for you other than tell you, be aware. Yeah.
Hey, do you have any plan to differentiate between required versus optional permissions?
No.
Okay.
Do you want, I can give you a bit more of an explanation, but the idea is we kind of felt that a lot of folks would, if there was a required option, we'd find very quickly most things would be required.
Yeah.
And we felt for applications where they truly are required, like it should probably make sense to the user by the purpose of the application. It's like I'll use WhatsApp as an example, since they were in the keynote. They upfront want to verify your phone number, right? It's how they make sure that you're the owner of a phone number and they reference all your links. So if you say no to that, I expect them to be like, I don't know what you want me to do.
Yeah.
So I think there'll be pretty clear kind of cases for apps to take that behavior where they don't need the OS to help in that enforcement.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
So my question was already asked about the libraries and how concerned are you with behavior is going to be breaking with all libraries and everything, and also the problem that is going to be created with analytics providers because they require a lot of dependencies that we don't know about. Something to be considered.
Yeah, so lint is going to flag it. So at least you should be able to know. If you look at lint, it will let you know.
It'll be sandboxed.
Yeah.
So change my question then. You talk about a support library that was going with backwards compatibility. What are you throwing in there? What are you putting in there?
What is it?
Yeah.
It's essentially if you're calling the new code in your application that's on targeting API 23. We want to make sure that you're not going to explode when you're running on other OSs if you happen to run that code.
So the method flow checks are going to be in the support libraries, right?
No, there's versions of them in the support library for old OSs, but it's in the SDK, the proper SDK, the OS SDK.
Okay, thank you.
I saw that Android M has a new auto update capability as well. Do you know if permissions will be carried over as part of this in addition?
Auto update?
So if I were to uninstall or reinstall, I would have all of the previous data synced up to Google Drive?
Yeah. Permissions is not a part of that. When the application's uninstalled, we will start anew, as if it's a new situation.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Thank you all.